In today's Cutter Consortium webinar, Hillel Glazer will uncover the secrets of incorporating non-value-added necessities into the value-added work stream. Hillel will reveal some of the common mistakes that hinder high performance, and he will help you understand how your organization can break the leadership and cultural molds that don't work in order to make a complete shift to high-performance operations. Hillel Glazer is a senior consultant with Cutter's Agile Product and Project Management practice. He is recognized as the world's leading authority on introducing lean and agile concepts into the regulated world. Hillel's professional passion is to work with companies that are motivated to achieve world-class operations and excellence. His diverse experience includes working in the aerospace and defense industries, working with systems engineering groups, federal agencies, .com operations, and financial, medical, and transportation organizations to support their systems development. Welcome, Hillel.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so is pretty much what the introduction material told us about, and hopefully that's why you're here. What I would like to set the stage for, however, is that there's basically two competing interests in becoming a high-performance operation. One is everything to do that brings money in the door, clients in the door, and produces products and services that you can be proud of. The other is all the regulatory compliance stuff that needs to happen regardless of whether you want it to or not. So oftentimes an organization is faced with this challenge of getting the regulatory compliance stuff to happen with the least disruption to the operation, because the more disruptive external requirements are to the operation, the less profitable they are. That's pretty much a given, that the external requirements typically eat into the profit by way of making the operation cost more, slowing things down, and so forth. I'm hoping that everyone listening has a appreciation for that experience. So high-performance operations is a result of looking at how you can incorporate the requirements and regulations and governance into what it is that you do that adds value to yourselves and to your customers, such that it minimizes the negative impact, maximizes the compliance, and as a result becomes a much more seamless operation as a whole. What we'll see that shouldn't come as any surprise is that the things that are important to be a world-class operation happen to also be important in becoming a high-performance operation that leverages compliance in a way that helps them gain a competitive advantage. So there's actually several things going on at once. Doing the things that are necessary to be a world-class operation, but on top of that, looking at the compliance requirements, looking at the regulations and so forth, and we'll see what regulations and what I'm talking about, like ISO 9000, CMMI, EVM, DoD, this, that, or the other thing, the European standards, FDA standards, transportation standards, all those compliance, safety things, any one of them. And by looking at what they're really up to, what those expectations, externally typically imposed expectations, either governmental or industry imposed, seeing what they're about, and then incorporating those expectations into how the operation actually functions. So the presentation, high performance operations, not only do they do these things, but they are accomplishing what is in the regulations. They leverage compliance to lower cost of operations, increase profit, and gain competitive advantage. And that's really what we're trying to do. All things being equal, when you have multiple demands on the business that spends the least, if everything is equal between two competing companies or operations, if their market share is relatively the same, their price structures have to be competitive, so they're relatively the same, they're looking at each other as peers, then the company that is able to incorporate all the compliance stuff with the least impact, negative impact, on their bottom line, on the middle of what happens between the top line and the bottom line, is going to be more competitive. That's one of the areas that we found to be dreadfully under-evaluated, underappreciated is many organizations try to improve their products, improve their services, improve their sales, improve a lot of things about their operation, but the compliance stuff doesn't seem to hardly ever get addressed. And this is a new area that is going to be one of the few bastions of opportunity to where we can really leverage things that cost us the profit, cost us money, cost us time. So how do we do that? Well, this is going to be a lot of storytelling and discussion on a bit of the how, hopefully enough of the how to give you a flavor for what you might be able to do in your own operation. Systems thinking. I borrowed this slide, so there's the attribution. Systems thinking is at the core of how we can leverage compliance to lower cost, increase profit, and gain competitive advantage. And specifically, the thing about systems thinking is that we're going to be looking at the operation and how it works as a system. And so the way in which the operation actually functions can be created and modeled as a system, and the components of that system are what we need to expose, not to paralyze ourselves through analysis, but to understand how they work. And so while a lot of systems thinking looks at things from a perspective of how do we make the sum greater than its parts, we're actually going to take that and go a little bit the other direction. We're going to understand how the whole works because of its parts, not how do we rebuild. So we're not looking at re-engineering. We're not looking at rebuilding the system and trying to go from the minutia back out again. We're trying to actually find out what's going on inside. So here we come to the first story. This first story is going to kind of set a metaphor for a lot of how operations need to function. And the metaphor I'm going to be using throughout the presentation is a metaphor of flying, both in terms of piloting as well as in some basic fundamentals of aerodynamics and flying. So this is what the approach looks like to the airport that I'm flying into, mostly my favorite airport. And what happens one day is I'm coming along in a plane that can fly incredibly slowly. It's a very light aircraft. It's 4-passenger. There's only 2 of us in the plane at a time, maybe 3 if I recall. But there was a very stiff headwind coming right down the runway, as a matter of fact. So this plane that could already fly slowly to begin with was now flying even much more slowly over the ground, mind you. So just as a little bit of aerodynamic education, if you don't already have one, is that the plane stays in the air not by virtue of how fast it's moving along according to somebody measuring it on the ground, but according to how fast the air, which was hard to see, moves over the wings, okay? So if you're flying into the wind, meaning the wind is pushing you in your face, then you actually have a much higher wind speed or air speed over the wings than you would just measured on the ground. So in this very light aircraft, if you've ever seen an ultralight or a glider, you know that planes can mirror or mimic a kite under the right conditions. You get a plane that's light enough, in fact many ultralight aircraft look like big kites with a gondola and a person strapped to it, or a hang glider, right? So it looks like a kite. Well, even an airplane made out of metal can operate like a kite when there's enough wind, meaning it's not going to go anywhere, it's just going to hang in the air with enough wind. So here I am, coming in for this landing, and with the airplane's ability to fly so slowly, my airspeed was right where it needed to be, because if without the airspeed I'd fall out of the sky, but my ground speed was slowing down rapidly. And next thing I know, a big gust of wind comes along and just pushes the plane so hard, it felt, just as we see in this picture, like the plane stopped in the middle of the air. Now, I don't know about you, but it's kind of a disconcerting feeling to have this notion of being in an airplane that really you mentally understand is supposed to stay in the air by going forward, to suddenly be hanging in the middle of the air like a helicopter with no forward momentum. And that's how it felt, of course. And I'm coming in, and next thing I know, it feels like the plane's not going anywhere. And, you know, I don't panic. I'm just like, my first reaction was, oh, my God, only I said it with a few more expletives. And 2 things happened at once. I point the nose at the ground, and I jammed on the throttle because I was idling my way towards the airport. And just enough airspeed to keep myself from losing my mind, because hanging in the middle of the air, 40 feet off the ground, 100 feet from the airport's threshold is not the place I want to be. What you cannot see in this picture, by the way, is if we were to look straight down, there's water. So 40 feet in the air above the water, 100 yards or 100 feet from the end of the runway is not where you really feel like hanging out. So just enough throttle pushes me forward enough, and I pretty much landed right on those stripes and was practically able to exit the airport or the runway almost immediately because of such strong headwinds. So what's the moral of the story, and why does it have anything to do with high-performance operations and compliance? And this is what it has to do with it. It has to do with the fact that you have to make choices, and you have to be aware of the choices you have. And in a high-performance operation, you need to be able to respond to the conditions, because sometimes the conditions are not going to be necessarily anticipated. And if you don't have a response to your ability to anticipate the type of responses you might need, then everything that comes along, not only the truly unique stuff, is going to be a challenge. And a high-performance operation can't be making decisions about what really could occur at any time, and predictably, something is going to happen. You understand that when flying, you know there's going to be wind. You know there's going to be these other conditions, and so you need to be able to respond. And a high-performance operation needs to have that kind of awareness and insight in order to be able to respond to the conditions, so that they're not always inventing the wheel for everything they need to respond to. And this is what happens very often when compliance comes along, is because they're not really thinking through in advance what the compliance is asking for. They end up reacting constantly. If I had to take the time to react or to panic, if I had the time to panic while hanging 40 feet over the water and 100 feet short of the runway, then I probably wouldn't be talking to you about this story today. It'd be at least a much more wet experience. And the point being that you have to understand the dynamics of what's going on in the operation. You have to understand the compliance before the opportunity comes or the need comes to actually comply. So here are the things that you need, among others. You need to know what's going on. You need to know your numbers, metrics. You need to trust the process more than your gut. Why? Because my gut told me I was hanging in midair. The reality was there was 40 or 50 knots of wind between the airspeed of the aircraft and the wind from the air from the wind, that kept the plane in the air. Probably could have kept the plane in the air indefinitely under those conditions, with just enough forward momentum and just enough airspeed from the wind. So enough from the engine and enough from the wind to keep the plane hanging there for quite some time. But my gut told me I wasn't moving, despite the fact that my numbers told me I was. So you have to trust the numbers and know the numbers and trust the process more than your gut, because, or at least not to say intuition and gut doesn't play a role, but it needs to know its place when the decisions need to be made. You need to understand performance. So we can't be a high-performance operation if we don't actually understand the nature of the performance. What causes our performance to behave in certain ways? What causes the outcomes of performance to have? And this is the thing that I think provides people with a lot of reason to appreciate piloting as one of those few, I think, professions or hobbies or capabilities that has so much cachet, is because you have to keep all this together all the time. And a high-performance operation is that kind of operation. They keep all this stuff together all the time. It's constantly changing. It requires their constant attention, and yet they're able to hold it all together. So that's what separates the world-class high-performance operations from the not necessarily high-performance operations. So specifically, business is like flying, and this is why. There's constantly competing interests on the airplane, just like in a business. You have, in an airplane, you have thrust, drag, lift, and weight. And I apologize for the fuzziness of this picture. It was a very much smaller picture, so when you make it screen-sized, it's a little too big. Anyway, but you get, this is actually not an unfair representation of the type of plane I was flying at the time. So lift and weight sort of balance each other. You know, when you're in the air, you have just enough lift to keep you from going down, which is being pulled down by weight and gravity. Weight is mass times gravity. But anyway, so when you have enough lift, you'll stay kind of where you are. If you have more than enough lift, then you'll climb. And when you have not enough lift, or you purposely point the plane towards the ground, then the weight is more than the lift, and you'll come out of the sky, and preferably in a controlled manner. We're going to talk mostly about thrust and drag, because what people don't realize is that there is no lift without some amount of drag. Drag is actually caused by lift, among other things. What too many operations do is they try to compensate for drag. And what we're going to refer to throughout the presentation is performance is a drag. Compliance. Compliance is a drag. And that the more we deal with compliance, the more we have to deal with compliance, the more we have to deal with drag, the more drag it creates. The irony is that if lift and thrust are performance, and weight and drag are compliance or other aspects of operational cost, then clearly we want to maximize lift and thrust and not minimize drag and weight. The irony is that when we add lift, we add drag, so that the more capable our companies become, the more we scale up, the bigger we get, the faster we go, the more drag we have to pull along. And the trick is in adding disproportionate amounts of drag, or disproportionate amount of lift and thrust for the incremental amounts of drag and weight that we have to add. In other words, if we had too much lift too quickly, then we may be adding too much weight too quickly. If we add too much thrust too quickly, we may be adding too much drag too quickly. So we'd have to be able to have enough lift and thrust to overcome drag and weight, but if we only deal in one of these components, we will sub-optimize our high-performance operation. We'll get to that again a little bit later. The thing to understand for now, however, is that drag is added when we have more lift, and so just adding thrust doesn't always add enough to overcome the drag. Here's how so this is what we need to understand. We have to understand the need. The need is to have an operationally excellent organization. That's kind of what we'd all like. We'd like to have a high-performance operation, which is in many ways synonymous with operational excellence. What are the components? Earlier I talked about systems thinking. There are components to the system, and the components are pretty simple. I mentioned them earlier. There's compliance, and then there's excellence, and these two things seem to be constantly at war with each other. Ultimately, what we need is a solution that makes compliance and excellence work well together. So what we're really after, if we look at this as a systems engineering exercise, what we're really after with this systems engineering exercise is to come up with a solution that allows the high-performance operation to emerge. So let's talk about focusing on the right things. This is a picture from an F-16's heads-up display. This is not a real enemy. That's another F-16, so they're just playing. But the point is that you have to focus on the right things. And I think that's kind of understood, that many businesses and business people will tell you have to focus on the right things, but what are those right things? Sometimes focusing on the compliance is not the right thing. Sometimes focusing on top line is not alone. Sometimes we focus too much on top line or too much on savings at the bottom line and not enough on what's in the middle. We want to be able to increase our performance, using the plane analogy. We want to increase our lift and our thrust. But we don't necessarily want to add too much drag or weight. And oftentimes, because we don't understand the whole operation as a system, we inadvertently add more thrust or more drag than we do thrust, or more weight than we do lift. And so we end up sub-optimizing our operation. Most businesses, unfortunately, only react by adding thrust, go faster. And a lot of times, go faster is top line, sales, 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 sales. And this is just adding thrust, and not necessarily adding anything of benefit to lift. The fact of the matter is that a bigger engine weighs more. And using the analogy, a bigger engine that weighs more adds more weight. A bigger engine that weighs more, adds more weight, requires more thrust to move forward and requires more lift, but doesn't necessarily compensate for its own additional weight. So you end up with more drag and more weight. Yeah, you've got thrust, but just enough to compensate for lift, not necessarily enough to actually increase performance. By only adding thrust, you're only really ultimately adding drag. So going back to the business rather than the airplane analogy, adding top-line sales without understanding its effect on the operation will prevent an organization from being high performance. Dealing with compliance by simply throwing bodies, throwing money, throwing paper at the compliance is only adding weight and drag, not increasing performance. A better solution is to reduce things that cause drag and weight, to increase lift for the same amount of thrust. If we are actually looking at, instead of constantly increasing on the lift and the thrust side, why don't we start looking at reducing drag and reducing the weight? Since if by adding thrust to overcome compliance adds drag, and by adding weight to overcome compliance only offsets the amount of lift by the weight we've added to overcome compliance, we then again add drag, slows the plane down, in fact. So if we actually try to reduce drag and weight, then we can actually have better thrust, better lift, thereby better performance for the same amount of thrust, but for less drag, less weight, which actually ends up meaning that we're doing better. And in a compliance situation, what we're able to do is by reducing the drag and reducing the weight, we're improving compliance. And the way we do that is we have to engineer, if you will, a solution, a better operation. We have to come up with something that produces less drag, either a wing or a body that produces less drag, or weighs less. The structure weighs too much, which is why you see so many things moving to plastics, composites, as opposed to metal, because they're almost as strong, if sometimes stronger than the metal, and they weigh a heck of a lot less than metal. So we've basically built a plane, the same plane out of metal versus the same plane out of plastic or composites would weigh several hundred pounds less in plastic than it would in metal, which you see so much happening today, as our cars have been doing this for decades. So performance tells us how we're doing. Working on compliance is nothing, so I'm equating compliance with profit drag, okay? I think that's pretty clear. Working and focusing only on compliance, we're really just looking at profit drag. So back to our plane, our actual target. When we don't understand our capabilities and we don't understand what defines our performance, it's a lot like aiming at the wrong target. So if this was a real situation and we don't understand performance, we'd be aiming at potentially our own ally or our own colleague in this picture. But if we don't understand what's going on, we could be easily aiming at the wrong target. So what constitutes performance? What should we measure? Well, this is a borrowed slide again from organizations that understand some things about business performance. And you can see regulation over there on the far left. So this organization doesn't ignore organization. This is from a German company. And what happens that you see a picture like this and people freak out. They're like, oh, they're afraid of measuring because the sheer what's out there of what could be measured is overwhelming initially. So they measure nothing, at least, or sometimes they measure nothing of real import, and they end up measuring very simple terminology, things that maybe ADD people on Wall Street appreciate, but really things that don't tell you the true performance of the operation. So here's a couple things. How about if we started with measuring time, quality, and cost? That's important to an operation. It's pretty straightforward. I think there's a lot of things we can learn by looking at time, whether more time is good or less time is good, quality, which is usually in defects or in first-time deliveries or some other customer-oriented or product-oriented measure of quality, and, of course, cost. Now, I could have written TQM here for money, but I really didn't want to go there for now. But the point is that time, quality, and cost, the cost of operations, the cost of time, the cost of defects, the cost of customer acquisition, things that take time, require quality, and cost money. Performance doesn't have to be as complicated as this chart. It's like find anything in your business that's important in your operation that ties to time, quality, and cost. Measuring whether or not you're complying is profit drag. There's compliance if we can understand that it's really not something we were putting our business together to do in the first place. But a lot of organizations worry about whether they're complying by measuring whether they're complying, not measuring what compliance does for them, what the requirements do for them. Measuring compliance smacks of Goodhart's law. If you're not familiar with Goodhart's law, it's not a real law, but it turns out that a British parliamentarian in the 70s came up, his name was Goodhart, came up with this realization that if we turned policy into numbers and measured the efficacy of our policy by the numbers that we could measure, such as number of people served, number of dollars or pounds or whatever spent, then we gain the system that we only measure for that policy instead of actually measuring for what the policy was there in the first place to accomplish. And many organizations, when it comes to compliance, that's precisely what they're doing. They're measuring for whether or not they're complying, not the underlying purpose of complying in the first place, other than, there's certain compliance issues I'm not going to argue have no place in business as far as value. I don't find it terribly valuable to my business to pay taxes, for example, and if I don't, I'll be out of business. So there are some compliance that is a profit drag, and I have yet to figure out how to not make it a profit drag, other than shut the business down. So if the real issue is I'm paying too much taxes and I don't want to, the only answer is to shut the business down to stop paying taxes, but that's really that's a non-starter. But the point being that there's some compliance that we can't solve. But for everything else that is solvable, first we have to recognize whether or not it's solvable, and to many organizations, that's the first step. Which of the compliance challenges don't have to be like taxes? And to be open about it, what I've found in the decades of doing this work is that most of the compliance requirements are not like taxes. In fact, there's a reason behind them that they exist that helps organizations actually improve were they to follow them effectively. But what ends up happening is that they end up measuring just whether they comply, they game the system, they study to the test, and they produce only what they need to produce in order to comply, and as a result, they increase profit drag. Here's an example. I tried to find something close, but this kind of gets the idea, is that the proposal is fully buzzword compliant. I think we've all been there writing proposals for certain age entities where if we had, we try to throw in as many of their favorite buzzwords to make sure that they're appreciated or something. But what it really says, though, is that when we're working for compliance, we're really adding bureaucracy, willfully adding bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, if you read Jim Collins' Good to Great, he does a great example. Is to compensate for incompetence, which we might understand now why governments agencies are so bureaucratic, is because they fundamentally must compensate for incompetence. Not that they're saying that their employees are incompetent, but that the system as a whole doesn't have an intelligence. The system as a whole is really hard to manage. The system as a whole, the whole government, is not going to communicate with itself. It's not a living entity. And so, it's in many ways, by definition, the government's system is incompetent at running itself. So we have to create a bureaucracy to get it to run. But that doesn't mean that our businesses need to be a bureaucracy to run. It doesn't mean that our businesses have to follow in the same footsteps of creating a bureaucracy to comply with everything that the bureaucracy needs. So too often we match our business to the organizations that want the compliance instead of simply working out smarter ways to comply to feed their bureaucracy without having to create our own just to feed it. So here's an example, some public examples of what's of bureaucracy. Some little tiny pieces. I've seen dozens of linear feet of these kind of things just for compliance, and it's truly wasteful. These things do gather dust. No one picks them up except when they have to. So instead of measuring for compliance, how about if we measured for the benefits of compliance and what the underlying performance of compliance is? So back to my runway. Different story, same runway. I was told to land on a certain spot of this runway. This is going back to when I was still training. And I was told to land on a certain spot of the runway, and I was like 5 or 8 miles away from the runway. I could pretty much see the runway at that point, but it was still pretty far away. And I was told to hit a certain spot. Well, from 5 or 8 miles away, certain features of the runway stand out much more than certain other features. And what had happened was I looked at the runway from when I was told to land on this certain spot. And I was told, so I looked at the runway from 5 or 8 miles. I picked the spot, which I thought was the spot that was told I was asked to land on. I was practicing a certain type of landing. And that's in my mind what I fixed on. I fixed on that one spot. And so for the next few minutes as I approached the runway, I maintained that spot in my head. Verbally, I had exchanged with the instructor several times. You want me to land on the so-and-so? You want me to land on so? Yes, back and forth, 3 or 4 times. Okay, got it. So now I'm fixed in my mind where I'm going to land, and I'm angling the aircraft to get there. And I landed. Perfect landing in the wrong spot. Because I had fixated from too far away on a target that was the wrong target, and I never adjusted. I immediately, as soon as he told me I missed my landing by 1,000 feet, I was incredulous. I'm like, what do you mean? You told me to land on the, and as I thought about it, I looked around like, you're right. I actually landed on exactly the wrong spot. And he's like, yeah, it was a perfect landing. You were lined up for that spot perfectly the entire time, but it was the wrong spot. So you landed exactly where you wanted to land. It's just not where I told you to land. And the reason behind this is because I was focusing on the wrong performance measure. I had focused too far away on something that I didn't understand clearly enough, and I never went back to check. And I landed perfectly on the wrong spot. So in other words, in your business, you would be focusing on targets that you don't understand enough of what's going on beforehand to be able to hit those targets. And then you aim for them, and you might hit them, and they're not even the right targets in the first place, and you never adjust along the way. Compliance generates a lot of that kind of behavior. So if we're not supposed to focus on compliance, what should we focus on? Well, in many cases, we're trying to focus on the process, or we're trying to focus on improvement or compliance in general. That really isn't what to focus on. A lot of money is spent on process, sometimes in conjunction with the word improvement, and more often compliance of lots of different flavors. And really, that doesn't matter to the bottom line of the business. Focusing on that is different than focusing on what matters to the business or what matters to the business's performance. So if we subordinate all of our focus and attention to performance, then anything we do with processes and improvement and compliance and standards and requirements will, if we subordinate them to performance, we'll actually get some value add out of them. So we have to identify and distinguish 3 different interoperating flows. There's the workflow, there's these 3 different flows. There's the value stream flow, which is where we actually get paid. It's what we do that our customers want, without which they'd scream. And this is the stuff that they really care about when they ask us for something to do. There's the value stream. Then there's the work stream, which is everything that's necessary to make the value stream happen. If it didn't exist, the customer wouldn't care. But as a business and operation, we know we couldn't get the value stream to work if we didn't have the work stream. So the value stream might be, depending on what your business is, if you're a software developer or an IT provider, the value stream would be the thing that develops the software, or the things that provide the IT services. The work stream would be a lot of other stuff, like your configuration management system, your trouble ticket system, your help desk. All that would be work stream. It makes the value stream happen, without which it doesn't so much work. But if that didn't exist, the customer wouldn't care, wouldn't notice. So the difference between value stream and work stream is that the work stream supports the value stream and is often impossible to get the value stream to show up without it. Whereas the bureaucracy, that's completely outside. No one would care if that went away. Neither you nor the customers would care. Some other entity might care if it went away, but that is still a necessary part of the business. And when compliance isn't addressed effectively, the black ring of bureaucracy is much, much, much larger than it needs to be compared to the volume of the work stream and the value stream. These are nested on purpose because there is no value stream without a work stream, and there is no business effectively without some kind of bureaucracy. The real goal here is to make the bureaucratic ring as thin as possible, despite the fact that it envelops the other two. So how do you know whether or not you're looking at the right things? How do you know whether you've properly identified value stream from work stream and bureaucracy, and how do we streamline it? Our favorite friend, time, quality, and cost. So what improves performance? How do you measure it in? How do you build it in? That's where we go back to engineering the system, engineering the solution. This is not going to happen naturally and organically. If we waited for it to happen naturally and organically, it would take a lot longer. Darwin didn't happen quickly, whether or not you believe in it or not. Darwinism and the process to Darwinism takes millennia. We're running a business. We don't have millennia to wait for this to naturally, organically, self-select it out of our operation. We need to actually do something proactively about it. We need to engineer how the operation is going to be high performance. So standards and compliance, they actually have a role. And not all of them are bad. Some of you may recognize, and if you don't, that's okay. This is a photo taken from the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. I'm from Baltimore, so I can actually see where this happened when I drive downtown, where several hundred acres of downtown Baltimore City went up in smoke. And over about a day and a half, 2 days. Not for lack of firefighters or equipment, but because none of the equipment that was brought in from as far away as New York City and Richmond, Virginia, which are both 120, 135 miles away in either direction, was compatible with any of the equipment in the Baltimore City water system. None of the fire hydrant equipment, none of the hoses, none of the truck equipment, none of it was compatible. So all these people drove from hundreds of miles away. Remember, this is 1904. This wasn't like you had an interstate system to make it easy. They're rushing into Baltimore to help the town, save itself from burning to a crisp. And none of their equipment worked with each other. And so there is a place for standardization. There is a place for compliance. And we need to understand why it's there and what it's there to do for us. So I don't want to broad brush paint everything about compliance as being bad and negative and profit drag. In fact, if we dealt with everything as profit drag, of course it's going to be profit drag, but we have to understand why it's there and what it's doing. So here's 6 steps to start dealing with compliance the way you'll find it effective for yourselves. Step 1. When you read some compliance requirement, instead of adding the words thou shalt, XYZ, why don't we look at the question as what is that risk or opportunity, the risk it prevents or the opportunity it creates for following the compliance requirement? What if it's there? If there's a reason behind it, what is that reason? And generally speaking, I have yet to meet a compliance requirement that fits this category that does not either avoid a risk or generate some future opportunity, such as preserving information, because in the future we're going to want it. So every compliance requirement I've met either avoids a risk or generates an opportunity. So then instead of adding thou shalt XYZ, what's the risk or opportunity that XYZ says? And then we ask, how do we XYZ? And suddenly the answer shows up without having to change anything. And when we have to ask ourselves, well, why do we do that? Then we have a place to say, okay, we do that because of this. And so now we suddenly have something to show anyone that's looking that we're complying and we haven't had to change a thing. Now, in some cases, there are going to be places where we don't have an answer. We say, how do we? And we're like, we don't. Well, are you saying that we don't avoid this risk or we don't exploit this opportunity? And the answer is, no, we don't. It's like, well, that's not really smart business, is it? And most of the time the answer is, no, you're right, it's not. So we have to fix those weak spots. So those are 6 steps on how to deal with compliance, and just about any compliance requirement document can be addressed with these 6 steps. So here are some key connections in making all of this work. We have to understand what value is and how we can be disciplined around the value. We can understand what customer service is. Notice I didn't zoom in or out to make this separate. You'll see this coming together. And together, value and customer service will lead to profit. We've seen this over and over again. You know the likes of Southwest and Ritz-Carlton and Zappos and a lot of, Lexus maintenance. A lot of these are clearly connections between the customer service and value. So these things will help us work on profit. Let me talk about data for a second. This is the image of the volcano in Iceland from April of 2010. I was actually stuck in Ireland as a result of this volcano, which is, not the worst place to be stuck if you have to be stuck somewhere. But the Eyjafjallajökull thinker, whatever, you can't pronounce that volcano, this is an image taken from the air of the volcano as it was happening. And it turns out that the airspace over Europe was shut down, not because of the volcano per se. Well, the volcano did originally cause it. But really what caused the shutdown is they didn't have any data. They were operating an airspace system without any data on something entirely predictable. It's not like the Europeans didn't know that Iceland was covered in volcanoes. It's not like they didn't know that these volcanoes erupt on a regular basis. Iceland has something like 50 volcanic or volcanic-related earthquakes a day or something like that, or a month, some ridiculously high number. So this is all known quantities, and it's not like there are other places on the planet that doesn't have to deal with this on a regular basis, Alaska being one of them. And so they were operating without data. They made decisions on data of information and systems, and they were they shut down the airspace because of it. And this is what happens when you don't understand your operation. You just make decisions without data, and for 6 days, the world basically lost several hundred million euro in money and profit and opportunity, and lots of things went haywire for 6 days because of this airspace shutdown. So how do we overcome this? First, look at everything as a service. This is how I actually make all of this stuff work together. I say, what is the service this operation provides? What are the services these operations do? Every service can be broken down into this little workflow. What goes out the door? Who does what, for whom, from whom, when, what with what, and if something goes wrong, what happens? Every part of the operation can be broken down into these questions. And then you have the feedback cycle, you have communication, you have quality issues, your ability to stop the line. When you understand these things about the operation, it doesn't have to be to the ninth detail. It can be pretty superficial as far as operational definitions go. But a lot of these questions are often just assumed that people know, but we don't know about that because we've never asked, we've never documented it, we've never written it down, we've never created a diagram. And so what happens is this opportunity to improve, and all the metrics that go into it or that could come out from it are entirely unknown. How do we understand this? We can look at everything as a flow. Remember the flows we talked about before? And to understand what is the value of the flow. Understanding the workflows and understanding the value of the workflows, and there are multiple workflows. But looking at all the different pieces from what is the value that this flow generates. So instead of trying to convey that in a picture, I like this quote from Einstein better. So, and you can be a woman too, of course. This was decades ago, so we talked about men. But the point is that when we understand value, we have a much better understanding of what defines success. The other thing that has to happen, so services has to happen, defining things on value has to happen, and here's the biggest piece that I found, the biggest hurdle. Executives need to get out of their comfort zone. And that's of all the others. You can define yourselves as a service, you can understand your value, you can understand everything there is about the operation, but if the executives are not going to allow themselves to operate out of their comfort zone, to start allowing things to actually orient themselves towards a high-performance operation, none of this is going to happen. You know, at a very fundamental level, if things, the way they currently are, aren't achieving the performance results we want to see, things must change. And it's the executive that must allow those things to change. It's the executive that must create the atmosphere, the environment, the culture that will allow things to change. Because if we don't make that happen from their cultural perspective, from the leadership perspective, then things won't change. They'll be superficial at best, and people will become cynical about the flavor of the day because the true changes that really need to happen aren't going to happen because the executives won't make the changes in them and how they run and what they are to make the company able to be a high-performance operation. Without it, it falls apart because everybody can see straight through it. Anybody reading Drive or Delivering Happiness, Drive by Dan Pink, Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh, Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. There's tons of these books late in the last couple of years that really do a great job of describing this. So, what is this all about? Here's the whole picture. So this is the system. All of these pieces now make up a system for identifying what the operation is. And to put it all together, we have to understand what the current reality is. Now, this is taken from a patent I have pending on this process at the USPTO. But starting at the top, we need to understand the organization's reality before we can engineer the solution. And so much of this is actually about understanding the reality. I'm not going to take the time in this presentation to walk through every one of these boxes, but I want you to see that this is not something that happens through 100% inspiration, but can be something that happens in a very methodical way. So I'm just going to walk through, and this is kind of a breakdown of the different steps. There is a very well-defined step that I walk clients through that others can learn from, that others can follow, that we can actually create through following these workflows and activities what are the different pieces of the business. And so these are just breakdowns of the earlier top-level diagram. So you can see that this is clearly something that is not just a whole lot of creativity and engineering. It is an engineering method, but it is not just based on because I can do it. This is totally teachable, totally followable. And so this is just the last couple of slides on that. And here's one that puts it all together. But again, we're not going to be able. That's an entire hour and 2 hours by itself. So let's talk about certain things that make it all work. And this is, we'll start wrapping up. We have to understand values, focusing on the why, the what, and the how. Focusing on values frees the operation to conduct business in whatever manner works best for them, compliance included. What I mean by values is the ability to make a judgment based on this is more important to us than this. That's what I mean by values, not just, personal, religious, or political values. I mean, this is more important to our business than this. This over that. A over B. That kind of value judgment where we can prioritize. And then based on those values, we operate some principles, and our principles are how we make sure that our values are being upheld. I value my home. I value my wife and kids more. In principle, I'd spend all my time with my wife and kids, but in principle, I also need to understand that that's not always going to work, so I have practices. In practice, I have to go to work. But going to work also supports my value because I like to have my kids and family in a home. I'd like to send them to school. I'd like to have them clothed. So I have to practice certain things, which includes going to work, making money, making a living. I have not to be independently wealthy from 100 years ago when our stocks are just paying for me. So if anybody is independently wealthy that way, good for you, but I'm not one of them. So I have these values that I uphold, principles that make the values work, and these practices that I actually have to do to make everything work. So that's how I kind of look at the organizational approach to getting things done. And where the rubber meets the road, we actually have to have policies that lay out the law, patterns that describe behaviors that we like to see happen on our work, processes that tell us what are the outcomes we want to see from the way we work, and procedures that actualize getting the work done. So here's where we end up with documentation, if you want to call it that. But this is where we formally say this is how the work runs. Values, principles, and practices are more about leadership. Policies, patterns, processes, and procedures are more about operational facilitation. And we work through those previous flow charts I showed you to come down to this level. So, in conclusion, you take a systems engineering approach to understand flow. You see the services and the value of those flows. You understand all of the service and value. You facilitate a culture for performance excellence, and those are the major components of getting a high-performance operation. Of course, the devil is in the details, which, here comes the commercial, you can pick up for yourselves in about 2 months, available for pre-order right now on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, but the book itself comes out in the fall, and all of this material is actually in the book, and pretty much the book is laid out, or the presentation is laid out by chapters in the book. So you can see what this is all about, and if you have any questions, you can contact Cutter, contact myself, or you can tweet me. Those are ones, not L's. Somebody other guy has L's. But that's my Twitter ID, my Twitter name, and there I am flying. That's actually in the air. If you zoom in on my eyes, you can see in my glasses that there's the horizon and some land underneath that. So I thank you for your time and for participating in today's webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to text them or chime in.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillel. As Hillel said, at this point, we'd like to move to the Q&A part of the webinar. If you have any questions, you can simply type them in to the Questions for Hillel pod and then click on the speech balloon to the right of that bar. We do have a few questions, Hillel, so I'm going to start with the first one. Some compliance requirements, for example, paying taxes, seem to have no perceivable business value to the business that must comply with them. Are you saying your approach can even find value in these sorts of requirements?
The specifically example of taxes, no. There's some things that we cannot find a lot of value add. We can minimize a lot of how the impact of. So we're not going to say we can necessarily, we're not accountants, so we're not going to figure out how the best way to avoid paying taxes is. But there might be certain aspects of an operation that we build compliance into the operation so that it moves further from bureaucracy and at least gets into the work stream instead of living independent of the work stream and the value stream. And if we can't find a way to put it directly in the value stream, then we'll normally find a way to at least get it into the work stream that is not, in the bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy is pure overhead. Bureaucracy is pure waste. So certain things are not going to necessarily work well from from getting them entirely into the value stream. But that's not to say that that's true of everything, because I think the thing that we've encountered the most is that what people believe or perceive to be purely bureaucratic nonsense turns out that they're just not seeing the underlying value. But I'll admit, there are certain things I can't see the underlying value, and I never will, and the best I can hope for is to at least minimize the negative impact of having to do the compliance by working out the best ways for it to end up in the work stream, if not the value stream directly.
Okay, great. The second question that we have is, how long would you say this sort of evolution to high-performance operations would take?
Obviously, the big question depends on the size of the operation, the complexity of what they're doing, the different things that they're working toward. But a general rule of thumb is that we normally would set a working horizon of 3 to 5 years before we can, I don't like to say we declare victory, but where we've addressed the vast majority of what causes organizations to stay, to not achieve a high-performance state of operations. Some operations we've been able to do that in much less time, on the year and a half to 2 year order of magnitude. But 3 to 5 for most businesses. There's some businesses that this will take decades, and they're working on that plan right now. Some businesses will talk the talk but don't know how to walk the walk, and once they've learned how to walk the walk, they can make things happen very quickly. So obviously it depends, but we'd like to set expectations for a 3 to 5 year event horizon.
Okay, great. We have time for one more question. Are there particular industries, compliance requirements, or particular types of compliance this approach works in? Does it work in every industry and or for every type of compliance, and are there certain types of compliance requirements for which this works best or better?
That's a great question. Typically what we found is that there's going to be certain industries that have a lot of compliance that are industry-driven and safety-driven, engineering and technical-driven, where this approach can work for some of what they do, but that's not a lot of what they do. Because many times technical compliance ends up in product specifications much more than in the operation itself. And so without necessarily pinpointing it to a particular industry, it's the industries where their operation is strongly influenced with compliance requirements more than their product or service being influenced by requirements. There's some industries where there's a lot of bleed over where everything they do is driven by compliance, like healthcare and airlines, for example. And so we normally would draw a line between, well, we're not going to deal with the product side of your pharmaceutical company, but we can look at the operational side because we're not going to get into product requirements, but we can get into how your processes and things work. So typically speaking, where we find, the most pain is where the pain shows up where the operation is impacted, the profitability because of the operation is impacted by compliance, rather than the product itself where the product is specification driven and that's an engineering thing. Well, how they deal with it as an engineering task may be where we'll talk, but not necessarily about, if it says it must have a safety factor of 2, we can't make that safety factor of 2 go away, for example.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Hillel.
My pleasure.
I want to thank everyone who joined us today. If you have any further questions or comments about the content presented in today's webinar, we encourage you to call or email Hillel at hglazer@cutter.com. Please also visit cutter.com and go to the events section where you can register for other upcoming webinars.